Welcome to Practical Wisdom Stories, Soul Searching. Our guest today is Miri Rodriguez. Welcome, Miri.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. What a great podcast name. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm so excited to have you join because you really are a master of storytelling. And, of course, so much of our listeners are really learning how to create a story, tell a good story, be a good presenter. And so wanted to find out, and you actually literally wrote a book on it. So why don't we start with that of, how did you, first of all, get into storytelling?
Yeah, can I tell it in a story form? I think that's the best
Please.
way.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I started at Microsoft around 8 years ago, and I had a moment of reckoning because I was being bullied by four women the
Oh,
first year that I was there. Yeah, and it was really daunting and it was like confusing, right? I was like, why is this happening? And at one point I decided I can't be here anymore. I'm gonna leave. And when I decided somebody was like, no, you can't leave. You got to stay. I asked myself why. Why would I stay? And that really prompted a soul searching approach of like, why do I do things? Why do I come to work? Why is this important? And really kind of ignited in me this kind of curiosity about why I exist anyway, and why is my story important? And so fast forward 8 years later, what I've built from there is this idea of learn yourself, like yourself, love yourself, and then brand yourself. And
mm,
to me, that was a point of saying, if I learn my experiences, if I learn who I am, then I can share that in a story form, and I can inspire other people so they can do the same. Maybe other people are also being bullied. I can't change the bullies, but I can see where there's a connecting point where human and humans can be like, oh, this happened to her. Something similar happened to me, and learn from each other. And so I found this to be a fascinating journey. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have the techniques.
right.
And life as it is, you begin to turn into a space, and you kind of get through that space and end up, in this space as an expert. And that's what happened to me. I ended up actually doing this for a living, and wrote a book about it because I learned these techniques that have been not only on the business side have proven successful for storytelling, but also for branding yourself with story, your origin story that makes you unique. So
Yeah. Boy, and you're just the perfect person for the show because it really is. It's, the podcast name is Practical Wisdom, and you really have both of that. There's the practical bit. So maybe if you could also tell us, some of those practical strategies that you
yeah,
found. And then the second part is that wisdom, that you're really
wisdom.
elevating things about the human connection.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell us both of those.
Love it. Yeah. So practically, what I did was I didn't know how to put a story together. I realized storytelling was becoming a thing. People were starting to talk about it. I live in the marketing, digital branding space. So that was already, kind of coming up as a buzzword. And
Yeah.
so I was like, I know I need to do this, but I don't know how. I don't know what's the best way. When you possibly Google storytelling, Bing storytelling, you'll find someone telling you the hero's journey is the way to tell a story. And I was like, well, what if it's not? Somebody invented that. What if can I invent my own way of telling a story? Like, why can't I? And so I went from storytelling to story designing, and I
Mm,
used
cool.
practically the storytelling techniques of design thinking, which is a 5-step approach. So it's actually empathize. It is define, it is ideate, prototype, and then test your stories, really story concepts. And it's a
Yeah.
fast fail approach is where you can actually think about little stories, little concepts, and then test them with your audience to see, are you going, they're guiding you in the process to say, no, I don't like that story, or I don't like that theme. And they basically give you that immediate feedback where you start iterating and reiterating until you get it.
I love that, the idea that it doesn't have to be a story. I think sometimes people think it means a long time. A lot of times
Yeah.
when I'm teaching my clients, I'll substitute the word anecdote, because I think sometimes we can just do it in like 20 seconds worth even to get the idea and they get the gist. And you're right. Then we kind of test out to see which is the right thing. And how perfect that, I think one thing you're modeling is the importance of tailoring it for the audience, that you work in technology, that you're using this analogy of
Yep.
testing, et cetera, and just applying it to, a soft skill and human interaction. So thank you. I think that same model could be applied to that, maybe that wisdom part around that human connection as well. So gosh, that's really you're really insightful.
Oh, thank you. That's actually the wisdom part of that is through my process of design thinking, it was immediately real to me that the first step and really the end step, because it's a cycle, is empathy. And I was like,
Mm.
oh my gosh, well, that makes sense. But there's other things that make sense in your head. And then when you actually put them to practice, you're like, oh, wait, it's not how I expected it to work out. And I realized, first of all, I'm not an empath. That's not one of my core strengths. So I had to learn empathy as a soft skill, which I didn't know that was a thing. And so
Yeah.
I've been on this journey of building my empathy levels to be able to deliver great stories, understanding that all of us consume content differently as well. So I can't assume that when I'm landing, it's going to land the same way for everyone. Everyone has lived experiences that are different. And so how do I zoom out and zoom in enough that I'm landing concepts and themes that everyone can relate to, but at the same time, we all have a different experience with. It's called the story persona. So if I talk
Mhm.
about a sad story, you're going to relate to it in a way that you're going to feel sadness, but maybe differently, right? The
Yeah.
other day I was in a workshop and someone told a story about when he was 16 and he found himself in a foreign country, hungry and by himself in an apartment because he had taken the leap to travel somewhere and be by himself. And he was telling the story, and there was mostly men in the room and just a couple women, literally a couple women, and I was one of them. And as everybody kind of began to react to his very powerful story, I reacted from a mom mode. I have a 16-year-old. So I was just like, oh my gosh, that 16-year-old being alone in an apartment, and all the other men were like, wow, that's so brave. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. And so it was incredible for me from a storyteller perspective to understand it's the same story. It's being consumed differently by all of us. That's the wisdom. And that's where empathy kicks in.
Oh boy. And speaking of empathy kicking in, I have a 16-year-old son too, so that's back to, that emotion that we bring, as soon as you mention reacting, I'm like, me too. That's what I would do. And I think that's one of the powers of the story is that element of me too. I see something of myself in you. I can understand and therefore create that empathy and understand that experience. So, I think, gosh, now more than ever, back to that human connection is, finding those points of connection, which is something that you said, just already, maybe that's silly, but like, I like you more. I feel like, we have something in common that we have
Sure.
16-year-old sons, that,
Right.
there's something there. So, how else have you learned, I think especially right now, our country is really struggling with social justice and
Yeah.
equality and connection and
Yeah.
and realizing not to be like overly mystical, but we are one. How do we create more empathy and open dialogue?
Wow, that is such a powerful question, and I appreciate you asking it. Um, I've learned there's three levels of empathy. So there's a cognitive empathy. It's the broader level. It's me recognizing you're human, or me recognizing you're a mom. I'm a mom, and that brings that point of connection, and we can empathize with one another for having teenage
Yeah.
sons, right? But it stays there. It's not that deep. The second level is emotional empathy. It's this type of empathy where I actually bring myself deeper into your space of being a mom. So I can tell deeper stories of motherhood, for example, that I know you understand, having a 16-year-old son that we discovered at the cognitive level. So it gets a little bit deeper and we can connect more. And the last level is actually, it's actually called compassionate empathy, and that's you actually bringing yourself as a human and allowing your own emotions to play into the story or the narrative. This one's the deepest one because and a lot of people find it very uncomfortable. It's very vulnerable. It's where you just say, hey, I'm human and I'm not perfect, and that's okay. And that's okay. And so when you translate that into social injustices, when you translate that into what is happening in our world today, in terms of racism and just discrimination, all of us are experimenting this very dark moment in our history, and that has what has been in our history, dark moments in general, from different places, right? I'm a Latino woman, but I do have Black family, and so I see their struggle is different than mine. I know that my son, who's 16, because he looks more like me, he can get into a car and he can get stopped by a cop, and he's not fearing for his life. But I have a nephew who has already had experiences that he does fear for his life. So it's as an aunt, it's also painful, right? But I'm not Black, and so there's so many layers to this empathy. When we come to the compassionate empathy level, it's recognizing the conversations need to be had and they're going to be tough, but we bring ourselves saying, I don't know much about the journey. I'm here to walk with you in the journey as well. I'm gonna probably not say the right thing or the best thing or the right thing or whatever might be the right thing. I'm learning through this process. There's a humility that we have in this process of saying we're all navigating it, and hopefully coming from the place of trying to understand each other and each other's pain and each other's experiences. I've had to say, I've also have white friends that have said, Miri, I'm now looking at, people are bypassing me for promotion just because they're of color, and now the companies are doing, something different. It feels unfair to me now. So there's a reverse discrimination idea. So all of this, we're all experimenting this from many, many angles, and they're all valid, right? So all of our experiences. So it's truly coming in compassionately and saying all of us are navigating different spaces, different emotions, but we're all in it together. We're the human race, and all of us should be really having the conversations, as tough as they are, to enable the spaces, respecting each other's, valid feelings, validating them for what they are, and listening. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. And, I love that idea, and just something that we experienced already. And I didn't know you had a 16-year-old son, there's that piece, that the next level is when we are different. Like, God, that seems like such a, harder bridge to cross. And also, I think a huge challenge is being vulnerable. Like you say that, some of even the words of emotion, vulnerable, make mistakes, how do we show up? And I think that is one of the scariest things, I think between us, like, we know once you've done it, you're like, it's so worth it. The friendships,
Sure.
That closeness, the connection, the success at work, all those things can come from it. But, somebody's, just starting that process to be vulnerable. There's been a lot of messaging around, stick to work, and be politically correct, and, don't, don't, be overly curious or pry into people's lives. So what either story or advice would you give on somebody like, okay, I want to try, but I don't know where to begin?
Yeah, in my book, I actually wrote an entire book about this piece in chapter 6. It's actually, the name is, title of the chapter is, If Story is Magic, Vulnerability is the Magic Wand, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I also talk about, there are limitations, and there should be some guidelines and parameters about how deep do we want to get with our emotions and how far are we willing to go. They do serve us. They serve us very well. They make us human. They humanize us, and they bring connection, just like you and I just had one. So there's so much richness there. But there's also an important piece of that, of safeguarding some pieces for our own sake and for the sake of others. And so in storytelling, because that's why for me it's important to design stories, not just tell them. Telling is just, I'm going to go out and tell a story and that's it. Designing is being very careful to understand your audience, to understand your why, to give that story a mission. And so I've been extremely vulnerable with specific audiences, typically younger women in tech. I know that when I become that, I can bring myself to their level. They're usually scared. They're usually apprehensive. They're anxious about their future. I'm 42. And so it's like, hey, you're going to be okay. I was there. It's okay. So I can tell those stories, and I can get very deep with them and connect with them at that level to inspire them. And of course, that story is not going to land with an IT pro doing cloud computing, right? So I got to tell them a different story. And so it really is about designing for your audience and creating those parameters, those engagement rules of engagement to how deep you're willing to go. Now, what I have experienced, honestly, is, and I've had some content go viral. Most of my content, all of the content that has gone viral has been emotionally charged. All of it. And I've been really calculated with some other content because I test it all the time. I continue to test it. So I live my own philosophies here. And so when I test it, it's really remarkable to me that it still works. That I can really write something super, super great and really poignant, and have the great words that I wanted to, and it's there, and people are like, yeah, this is cool, Miri. But when I go over here and I'm like, oh my gosh, guess what happened to the supermarket? And I tell that story, everybody engages. And so it's back to the idea that all of us as humans, are seeking that connection. We're seeking that meeting point with each other. We're hoping to see a little bit of ourselves in that story and to go, oh yeah, that's me too, or I've gone through something like this, or you know, in that connecting point. That's what makes us belong to the human race. And so that's the power of storytelling, is that when you can tell the story in a way that your audience connects with you, you won, right? You've taken them into the journey with you.
And you've taken me into the journey as soon as you like talked about testing and, you know, trying it out and being vulnerable, like just even while you're telling the story, like a memory popped into my mind, which was, you know, the most vulnerable that I'd been at work, because I'd never posted anything on LinkedIn, but
Okay.
I had volunteered at a Take Your Child to Work Day and taken my younger son with me. And it was just this cute little video, and he's in it with me too. And it had 20,000 views. And it was so crazy to me, because in my mind, I feel like I'm kind of downplaying being a mom and, you know,
Right.
trying to be more professional and whatever. And the very first time, you know, I hit published, it hit 20,000. And it was for the very thing, not that I hide being a mom, but I don't necessarily always talk about it. And I was like, wow, I guess people like seeing a kid on LinkedIn, or they like seeing a mom or parent or something like that. So I think that for me was a lesson, you know, both of testing, but also, you know, don't assume what people want to see or not, you know, to kind of try it out and test it and see. So.
Yeah, it really is. They want to see Nikki, the mom. They want to see Nikki, the other aspects of what makes you human, right? So when you're a mom, we already know motherhood is messy. It's all the things, right? It's all the
Yeah.
feels. So now we get to see a deeper side of you, and we go, wow, great. Like, people get curious, and the things that, you know, you asked me, like, why would people do this, or how can they start, or why, you know, why is that important? We often downplay. Use that word. We downplayed our own stories. We think they're just ordinary, nobody cares. But they actually, that's what makes them extraordinary, because you bring insight that I can't bring. You've been a mother for 16 years to a son. Is it a son or a daughter?
Son, yeah,
A
two boys.
son, right? And so I have a son, he's 16. So we're, you know, we have that in common. But if we sit here and talk about the last 16 years, we're going to have complete different stories and insights and learnings from motherhood. And that's the beauty, and that's what makes stories remarkable, because I can learn from yours and you can learn from mine, from many layers: the personalities of our kids, our own personalities, where they grew up, the geography makes a difference, just all of it. And so that's what, you know, what we think is normal or ordinary, it really isn't, because I learned from you, from something that to you was just your life, but to me it was like, wow, I didn't realize that, right? You give me insights from your life.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of insight from life and also parenting, is there a story or a nugget, you know, if you were to just, oh gosh, you get, you know, a minute to give some parenting advice or some insight, what would you say?
Parenting advice, man, I have to say a couple of things. One of the things that have served us as parents, so I have two boys. I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old, and they could not be any more different. I mean, they're just like, woo! And I think life gave us the first one first, because we would have gotten the second one first, we probably wouldn't have had any more kids. They're both amazing. They're just both really just completely different and wonderful in their own way. What we learned through that was understanding their personality was very important to us. So we took and we paid for personality tests, very deep personality tests, and it gave us so much insight to be a parent, and to discipline them, because the discipline is also different. It's you know, it's an approach. You want to guide them, and you want them to know that you're disciplining them with love, you know, out of love, that you're basically wanting to be better human beings. And so it was a different approach for both sides, because one is just not going to take authority the same way that the other one is. And so learning that was really insightful for us as parents, that we couldn't come across from authoritarian, like, you know, one size fits all kind of thing. They each have their own way of being not only disciplined but loved. So learning the love language was also important. So my oldest son, he's an acts of service love language. So he just, as soon as you serve him something, if you make him a sandwich, he feels loved. And when he does chores around the house, you know that he's just loving you. And so we've learned that, and that's important, because, you know, that's who he is. And so it's really understanding how they're loved, how they communicate, each of them so differently, and really reinforcing that love the way that they receive it. I think that has served us very well. I have to say our kids are incredible young men, and knock on wood, because They haven't gotten in any trouble at all. So that's pretty good.
That's amazing. I can tell you just bring so much emotional intelligence. For the listeners, if you haven't read The Five Love Languages by Gary Chapman, it's amazing. And it's so funny. I just had this, like, I was talking with my son, and he had, a friend, and he was talking about, like, I made cookies. He was like, thanks for the act of service. And they're like, oh, what's that? And he was like, oh yeah, well, there's these things. And he like went through, oh, it's quality time, affection,
That's right.
words of affirmation. And I was just like, oh my gosh, maybe it's too much for this kid. But I was like, all right, he's been listening somehow,
They get it. You sometimes you think it's like a black hole, and they come back and it's like say something you've said before. You're like, oh my gosh, they were listening.
Yeah, you're like, yes, when. One other thing, I love, work-life connection is something that I just have seen so much of, like some of the life lessons from work that to bring to work and vice versa. And, just even hearing about how you tailor to the personality, boy, that is one of the biggest things that I've gotten from back to work is how to adjust to the audience and like the different learning styles, personalities in the audience as well. So, I think there's the benefits of both, as we're encouraging people, read that book and, do some of the work, but there's this payoff and you get kind of a 2-for-1. If you do the work with your kids, you benefit to tailor your message at work, or if you're just doing it at work, then you realize, oh gosh, actually, my stakeholders have different personality and thinking styles, then you can tailor that way too. So thank you, for reminding us that. One other thing that you'd mentioned, and I just love, it's actually part of the Dale Carnegie course, is to tell a defining moment. And you'd mentioned about the childhood stories, which is just, I just feel like it's such a profound insight. So what is, you have a big vivacious personality like Miri, how did you get this way? Or, what's a funny story from your childhood that, helped you become who you are?
It's a great story. I'm a middle child, and so I think that really plays into the personality as well, because I felt like I had to hustle my way through life a little bit, a whole lot actually. My older sister is just a year older, and she is, the model citizen, and she did life as she prescribed it, and she like reached all her milestones at the age that she said she would. She's just wonderful. I love her so much. My little sister is more of like a little bit of the rebel. She's, she was spoiled and she does her thing. And then me in the middle, I was just like trying to find myself and my voice. And I found myself being very curious, but I was brought up in a very, very religious home, and in Venezuela as well, which is culturally and religiously, women, don't be curious, don't talk too much, they're seen, not heard. And I found myself just kind of questioning why I was so curious and why I couldn't learn the things like that it was basically not, it wasn't openly like, hey, Miri, you can ask all the questions, right? Come and ask, we're going to answer the questions. So I was just like, oh man, this sucks. I want to know, I want to learn. So I got in trouble a lot, but it was more from curiosity, things that I just wanted to do that I just was like, why can't I just do them? But as I grew up and more into adolescence, I found that curiosity was a good thing, and that it enables us to learn different people. And I was always very curious about people. Always, I could talk to someone, and I love to talk to elderly people. I think they have the best stories. I mean, they're just the best stories. So I found myself asking a lot of old people, stories, and I would draw things about them, and I would actually write poetry. And so it was really weird because I didn't think I would ever be a writer, and I never saw myself as a storyteller or a writer. But it's innately in you, and I think those things from your origin story, from your childhood, you begin to kind of see those patterns of who you really are at the core. Even though society or parents are trying to mold you into something, your core really is there, and it's going to come out anyway. And so by 18, I was already beginning to let myself be myself more. I had my boyfriend. It was a senior in high school, and I remember I actually came to the country when I was 12, and I was very worried about what people would say. I was, worried about my accent, and I just wanted to fit in. By 18, I was just like, well, this is me. I allowed myself to be more and more who I became, who I am today. And I found that very liberating. And it wasn't easy, to be honest. It was a decision that I had to make. I was like, look, people are going to like me or not. either way. Like I know that's just gonna happen. Like some people are gonna like me, some people are not. Might as well like me or not who I really am versus what I'm trying to be. So my story really is around stay curious if that's who you are, and if you're not, curiosity really is beneficial, especially when it comes to stories, because the more you ask, and you back to the workplace, the more you learn, right? The more you listen, the more you learn. And curiosity is listening. Curiosity is stepping back and not assuming. It's going, maybe I don't know, maybe I want to know, what is that about? And really ask the whys. And the more why I ask people, wow, the deeper the stories get, which I find very profound.
Awesome. Well, this is very liberating. I remember a meme, and this is something that I've shared with my students too, of like, how do you overcome that imposter syndrome and silence the inner critic? But it said, you might be the juiciest peach, and some people just don't like peaches, and gosh,
That's it.
that really resonates because I also feel like I've got this big personality, and I actually don't like peaches. I like nectarines better. Peaches are kind
I
of
like
fuzzy.
peaches. Peaches are pretty good, but nectarines are good too.
I'm like, okay. And there's room in the world for that, so the people who love
Yeah.
peaches, love them. You like a nectarine better, whatever, so
Peach
thank you.
cobbler is pretty good. Come on.
Yeah. Then, cause you can't taste the fuzziness, they're even better. So,
That's right.
okay. So to summarize, would you remind us the 5 steps again of the
Yeah.
storytelling? And then also if you were to just to succinctly give us that practical wisdom, how would you summarize that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the 5 steps to designing your stories with design thinking principles is to empathize. Empathize with yourself and empathize with the audience. Take a scope introspectively of your own feelings, and then realize how your stories are going to land. And that will be like the first step to your storytelling. Then you ideate. Define. You define your audience, define who they are. Make sure that if it's one audience, the stories might look different because there's different audience. So define your characters and your audiences, and the plot and the conclusion. And then ideate, find ways to forms to tell the story. Some audiences prefer a video form, others will prefer a blog. So back to empathizing, how do you land it best? It's not going to be one size fits all. Your stories will look different, and they should look different. So invent a path, invent the way. The hero's journey is only somebody else's idea. So create your own idea and give it to your audience. It serves them well. Then you prototype different ways to test them in the market. So these are now forms, little concepts of stories. I've done this so many times. I've failed, and it tells me every time how not to do it. So then I do it again, and then I win. And then I find myself a one-win story. It's short-lived. My stories have to change and evolve. My customers evolve. My audience evolves. I evolve. So reiterate, prototype, low cost, low effort. Now, not one big story, little story concepts, because it builds the theme of your story. And then at the end, you test with your audience, be vulnerable, fail fast. I know it's counterintuitive, but once you get out there and start doing it, you begin to design even more and more, and you kind of lose the ego in the process. You're like, okay, I'm failing. Oh, I won. Great. What did I learn? And then do it again. And the way that this manages in the wisdom side and the insight is, the more empathy that you bring to the process, the more authentic your stories will be. The more empathetic you'll become as a person. I can tell you 3 years ago, I was not as empathetic as I am today. And 3 years from now, I hope to be even more than I am today. So it's a self-improvement process. It allows you to meet people like you, Nikki, incredible people along the journey. And so it's been so rewarding for me. The intangibles are so wonderful from an empathetic standpoint, becoming an empath, really.
That's it. And how do we find your book?
Oh, okay. I have a copy so you can see it. My book. So you can go to mirirod.com. That's where you can I share a little bit of my personal stories and also why I wrote the book, and it'll have links to the book. You can also find it on Amazon, brand storytelling. Actually, you can Google brand storytelling and the book will come up, which is nice SEO. I didn't really plan for that, but Google's being nice.
That's it. Well, you've been nice. You're an absolute delight. Thank you so much for being my guest and sharing so much helpful advice to our listeners.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.